In Manhattan's underworld, Bruno Costa had never lost. Not a territory, not a negotiation, not a game. Then a frantic waitress with coffee-stained hands made him surrender in 8 moves, and he realized the most dangerous weapon wasn't the one you could see coming. The Night Watch Diner occupied a strange corner of Manhattan geography where legitimate business and criminal enterprise shared the same greasy tables. It stayed open 24 hours because its owner understood that darkness had its own economy, and men who worked in shadows needed somewhere to eat. At 34, Bruno Costa had perfected the art of controlled intimidation. He didn't need to announce himself. The room simply rearranged itself around his presence. His tailored navy suit and precisely trimmed beard spoke of old money and older violence. The platinum watch on his wrist was understated, the kind of detail that whispered power to those who knew how to listen. "Your usual corner, Mr. Costa," the owner said, already clearing the strategic position that offered sightlines to both exits and the kitchen. Smart business owners in Bruno's Manhattan learned to think tactically. Mabel Smith navigated the diner floor like she was defusing bombs in real time. At 25, every movement was calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum visibility. Refill coffee, clear plates, avoid eye contact, get tips, get out, get gone. Her dark blonde hair was escaping its bun, her uniform showing the evidence of a double shift, and her mind was already calculating how many more weeks until she'd saved enough to disappear to somewhere that didn't ask questions about her past. "Look at this." Dante, one of Bruno's capos, pointed to an abandoned chess set near the counter. "Remember when you played Moretti's advisor? Guy was supposed to be some kind of champion. You made him resign in 15 moves. Bruno's dark eyes flickered with interest. Chess had been his father's obsession, drilled into him alongside lessons about loyalty and leverage. The board taught you to see 12 moves ahead, to understand that pawns were expendable and queens were devastating when deployed correctly. Victory becomes boring when everyone refuses to play. "You could challenge anyone here," another soldier suggested, scanning the late-night crowd. His gaze landed on Mabel as she rushed past, juggling 3 plates and a coffee pot. "Maybe the stressed-out waitress needs a lesson in concentration." Mabel caught the comment as she slid plates onto a nearby table. Her stomach tightened. 6 months invisible, 6 months safe, 6 months undiscovered. "You." Bruno's voice carried the weight of absolute expectation. "Do you play chess?" She turned, clutching the coffee pot like a shield. His eyes were calculating, measuring, the way predators assessed prey. "I've seen it played, Mr. Costa." "Then you know enough to try?" He gestured to the seat opposite him with the casual assumption of compliance. "My associates believe it would be entertaining to watch me beat someone who doesn't know better. Humor me." The men around him were already smirking, anticipating easy entertainment. "I'm working, sir. I really should." Her eyes darted toward the kitchen, mapping her escape. 5 minutes. His tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. "Unless you're afraid of looking foolish." The challenge hit exactly where he intended. Mabel's jaw tightened. She set down the coffee pot with trembling hands and slid into the chair, hyper-aware of 4 dangerous men treating her like a joke they were about to enjoy. Bruno arranged the pieces with mechanical precision. "White or black?" "Black," she said, because counterattack had always made more sense than exposure. He opened with pawn to e4, aggressive, classical, the kind of move that announced superior skill. "Your move, waitress." Mabel stared at the board. Her exhaustion evaporated. Her breathing steadied. The frantic energy that defined her every movement suddenly crystallized into absolute focus. She moved pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense, immediately signaling this wasn't going to be the slaughter he expected. Bruno's eyebrow raised fractionally. He continued with knight to f3, standard development. Mabel's response came without hesitation. pawn to d6, then following with knight to f6 in the next move, building a hypermodern setup that sacrificed central control for explosive counterplay. Her fingers moved with decisive confidence, each placement speaking of thousands of hours spent in digital war rooms, commanding armies, calculating probability trees, surviving in competitive environments where hesitation meant defeat. 4 moves in, Bruno's casual expression shifted to concentration. 6 moves in, his jaw tightened as he recognized he was facing someone with championship-level pattern recognition. His soldiers stopped smirking. Dante leaned forward, confused. "Boss." "She's actually—" "Quiet," Bruno commanded softly, never taking his eyes from the board. 8 moves in, Mabel moved her queen to a5, and suddenly Bruno's entire position collapsed like a house of cards. He stared at the board, tracing the inevitable sequence. His king was trapped. His defenses were shredded. His rook was pinned. His knight blocked his own escape. "Checkmate in 2 moves," Mabel said quietly, demonstrating the forced sequence with efficient precision. The diner had gone completely silent. Bruno Costa, who'd never lost a territorial negotiation, who'd built an empire on calculated dominance, sat in stunned silence as a waitress dismantled his position with surgical brutality. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice stripped of its casual authority. Mabel blinked. And suddenly she was just a tired waitress again, shoulders curving inward, eyes dropping to the table. "I should get back to work." "No." Not loud, but absolute. "You don't play at that level by accident. That wasn't chess club strategy. That was instinctive, adaptive brilliance. Who taught you?" "Nobody taught me," she said, standing up. "It was just something I used to do, before." "Before what?" "Before it mattered." She grabbed her coffee pot and fled toward the kitchen, feeling his gaze track her like a targeting laser. Bruno sat motionless, replaying the entire game in his mind. Dante spoke carefully. "Boss, she demolished you. Should we—" "Find out everything about her," Bruno interrupted, his voice low and intense. "Where she lives, where she's from. Why someone with that level of strategic genius is hiding in a diner at 2 a.m. "You want us to scare her?" "No." Bruno reset the pieces slowly, his mind already racing ahead. "I want her back here tomorrow night. Tell the owner to arrange it. Offer her $500 for an hour of her time. Tell her it's a standing appointment." "Boss, she's nobody. She's somebody who made me retreat," Bruno said quietly, staring at the board where his king had been cornered. "And I'm going to understand how." The next night, Mabel returned reluctantly, drawn by money she desperately needed and repelled by attention she couldn't afford. The chess set was waiting. Bruno was waiting. And this time he'd studied her style, prepared counters, approached with respect instead of arrogance. She beat him again in 12 moves, adapting to his adaptations with the fluid creativity of someone who'd learned strategy in environments where the rules changed mid-game. After the 3rd consecutive defeat, Bruno leaned back, studying her face. "You're not going to tell me where you learned this?" "There's nothing to tell." "Then I'll figure it out myself," he promised. "Because someone with your mind shouldn't be invisible, and I always acquire assets I need." Mabel met his eyes finally, seeing the calculation there, the dangerous fascination. "I'm not an asset, Mr. Costa." "No," he agreed, his lips curving slightly. "You're the first person who's ever made me question if I'm playing the right game." Neither of them realized the board was already in play, and the stakes were far more dangerous than either of them understood. The next night, Mabel arrived at the night watch with her armor firmly in place. Sarcasm, caffeine, and a carefully cultivated attitude of someone doing this purely for the money. She'd spent the entire day convincing herself this was just a transaction, 1 hour, $500, then back to invisibility. Bruno was already waiting, the chess set positioned with mathematical precision. He'd changed tactics, she noticed. No entourage tonight. Just him, a single espresso, and eyes that tracked her movement across the diner with unsettling focus. "You came," he said, as if there'd been doubt. "You're paying me more than I make in 2 weeks to play a board game," Mabel replied, sliding into the chair with deliberate casualness. "I'd show up for half that. Capitalism and desperation make excellent motivators." His lips curved slightly. "Your move, waitress." "Mabel," she corrected, reaching for a black pawn. "If you're going to obsess over how I beat you, at least use my actual name." "I'm not obsessing. You're here alone on a Tuesday night, staring at a chessboard like it personally offended you. That's either obsession or a very sad hobby." She beat him in 14 moves, exploiting an opening he'd left while trying to avoid her previous traps. When she announced checkmate, Bruno sat back, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation that kept changing variables. "Again," he said simply. "That wasn't the deal." He placed another $500 on the table. Mabel stared at the money, then at him. "You're really that bothered by losing?" "I'm interested in understanding how you win," Bruno corrected, resetting the pieces. "There's a difference." "No, there isn't. Not for men like you." "Men like me?" "Men who think control and understanding are the same thing." She moved her queen's pawn forward. "They're not. Sometimes chaos just is, and trying to catalog it defeats the purpose." The second game lasted longer, 19 moves, because Bruno adapted, forcing her to abandon her aggressive opening for something more nuanced. She still won, but this time she had to work for it. "Better," she admitted, standing to leave. "Tomorrow night," Bruno said. Not a question. "I have a job, Mr. Costa, an actual one that doesn't involve indulging your existential crisis over a board game." "Bruno," he said quietly, "if I'm using your name, use mine." Something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't a command. It was almost a request. "Tomorrow night," she agreed. Surprising herself, same terms. By the 5th night, their games had developed a rhythm that felt dangerously like routine. Mabel would arrive with some sarcastic comment designed to maintain distance. Bruno would respond with dry precision. They'd play. She'd win. He'd study the board like it contained secrets to the universe. "You're getting better," Mabel observed on night 7, after a game that had taken 32 moves to resolve. "That's actually impressive. Most people double down on failed strategies rather than adapt." "Most people aren't playing against someone who treats the board like a psychological warfare simulator," Bruno replied, his eyes meeting hers across the scattered pieces. "You don't just see moves. You see intent." "How?" Mabel hesitated, her usual deflection catching in her throat. Something about the genuine curiosity in his voice dismantled her defenses. "Online war games," she admitted finally. "Thousands of hours of real-time strategy against people who didn't follow conventional patterns. You learn to read adaptation, not just memorize counters." "Why?" The simple question landed like a blow. "Because sitting still meant thinking about things I didn't want to think about," she said, the honesty surprising them both. "The games gave me problems I could actually solve." Bruno was quiet for a long moment, his fingers resting on his defeated king. "I was taught chess by my father," he said, his voice stripped of its usual calculated control. "Every mistake meant consequences, every loss was failure. The board was where I learned that weakness gets you killed." "That's terrible," Mabel said softly. "That's survival." "No, that's trauma disguised as training." She met his eyes directly. "Chess is supposed to be beautiful. It's supposed to be about possibility, not punishment." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. "Show me," he said quietly. "Show you what?" "How you see it. The beauty part." Mabel reset the pieces slowly, hyper-aware of his attention focused entirely on her. "Watch," she said, moving through a famous game, Kasparov's Immortal, explaining not the tactical brutality, but the creative brilliance, the moments where beauty and destruction became the same thing. Bruno listened, fascinated not by the moves, but by the way she spoke about them, her hands dancing over pieces, her voice animated with genuine passion. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her face instead of the board. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You light up when you talk about it," he observed, "like you forget to hide." "I don't hide. You absolutely hide." He leaned forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space between them. "You hide behind sarcasm and exhaustion, and this carefully constructed performance of someone too busy to be noticed. But when you play, you become someone else entirely. Someone who doesn't apologize for being brilliant." Mabel's breath caught. They were too close, the chessboard suddenly irrelevant, the air between them charged with something that had nothing to do with strategy. "You're afraid of being seen," Bruno continued, his voice low and intense. "I spend my entire life being seen, and I'm afraid of being known. We're both hiding, Mabel, just in opposite directions." "This is a bad idea," she whispered, but she didn't move away. "Probably." His hand moved across the table, stopping just short of touching hers. "But I haven't been able to think about anything except how you demolished every assumption I built my life on. In 8 moves, you made me question everything I thought I understood about control. That's just chess." "That's not chess. That's you." His eyes held hers with devastating honesty. "And I can't figure out if you're the answer I've been looking for or the question I've been avoiding." Mabel should have left, should have grabbed her money and run back to invisibility. Instead, she turned her hand over, letting her fingers brush against his. The contact was electric, terrifying, inevitable. "I can't be what you think I am," she said quietly. "I don't think you're anything except exactly who you are," Bruno replied. "That's the problem. I've spent my entire life around people wearing masks. You're the first person whose mask is more honest than most people's truth." The moment stretched between them, fragile and dangerous, until Mabel finally pulled away, breaking the spell. "Same time tomorrow?" Bruno asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," Mabel agreed, standing on unsteady legs. "Tomorrow." As she walked away, neither of them mentioned that they'd stopped pretending this was just about chess several games ago. The board had become an excuse, a language, a battlefield where 2 people who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable were accidentally learning to be seen. And that was far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The next night, Mabel arrived to find the chessboard absent. In its place sat a single manila folder, crisp and ominous against the diner's worn table. Bruno stood as she approached, his posture rigid with barely contained tension, not the casual confidence of their previous games, but something sharper, more urgent. "No chess tonight?" Mabel asked, trying to mask her disappointment with sarcasm. "Did you finally accept that I'm better than you, or is this where you tell me my services are no longer required?" "Sit down," Bruno said quietly. "Please." The please made her stomach drop. She sat. Bruno remained standing, his hands braced on the table, the controlled facade she'd watched crack over 11 nights now completely stripped away. "I need to tell you the truth about why I kept asking you to come back." "Because you enjoy losing," Mabel offered weakly. "Because I needed to understand how you think." He opened the folder, revealing photographs, surveillance images of a man in his 40s, sharp-featured and smiling in a way that suggested danger. "Luca Moretti. He's been systematically destabilizing my operations for 3 months. Unpredictable attacks. No pattern I can identify. He doesn't follow conventional territorial logic or traditional family protocols." Mabel stared at the photographs, her analytical mind already processing. "You think he's playing a different game?" "I know he is." Bruno's eyes met hers with devastating honesty. "Every strategy I've learned, every tactical approach my family perfected over 3 generations, none of it works against him." He's chaos, and I can't fight chaos with control. So you've been what? Testing me? Mabel's voice sharpened with betrayal. The games were just a job interview? No. Bruno sat down finally, and the raw vulnerability in his expression stopped her rising anger. At first, maybe, I saw how you played, aggressive, unconventional, brilliant in ways I couldn't predict. I thought if I could understand your mind, I could understand his. He paused. But then it became something else entirely. You became something else. Bruno, I need you, Mabel. The admission seemed to cost him. Not as a waitress I play chess with, not as a distraction from boredom. I need your mind, your strategic instinct, your ability to see patterns in chaos that look like randomness to everyone else. Mabel's pulse hammered. What exactly are you asking me? Bruno pushed a document across the table, a formal contract, dense with legal language. Strategy consultant. You'll use the chessboard to model Moretti's attacks, anticipate his moves, help me understand how someone who doesn't follow rules can still be countered. You'll have complete autonomy in your analysis. No one questions your conclusions, no one interferes with your methods. She scanned the document, her eyes widening at the compensation figure. This is more money than I'd make in 5 years. It's what you're worth, Bruno said simply. It's what I need you to be worth, because if I'm wrong about you, if I'm trusting the wrong person, this entire empire collapses and people die, including me. The weight of that confession hung between them. Mabel looked at the contract, then at Bruno, seeing him fully for the first time, not the controlled Mafia boss, not the man obsessed with chess, but someone genuinely afraid and genuinely trusting her with that fear. Why me? She asked. You could hire actual military strategists, game theorists with PhDs. Because they think like me, Bruno interrupted. They were trained in the same systems, the same conventional frameworks. You think like Moretti. You see the board as a living thing, not a static problem. You play like you're fighting for survival, not following a textbook. You don't know anything about me, Mabel said quietly. About why I think that way. About what I'm running from. I know enough. His voice was steady. I know you're brilliant and terrified and hiding from something that made you believe invisibility was safer than being seen. I know you play chess like every game is life or death because somewhere in your past maybe it was. He leaned forward. I'm not asking for your history, Mabel. I'm asking for your future. She stared at the contract, her mind racing through implications and consequences. This was the escape she'd been saving for, handed to her on a silver platter wrapped in danger. If I do this, I have conditions? Name them. Equal respect, not just from you, from everyone in your organization. I'm not your employee, I'm your consultant. That means when I tell you something about Moretti's strategy, you listen, even if it contradicts everything you've been taught. Agreed? Complete intellectual autonomy. I analyze the threats my way using my methods. You don't get to micromanage my process or demand explanations for how I reach conclusions. Done. And financial independence. Her voice strengthened. The salary you're offering, I want it structured so I can walk away at any time with enough resources to disappear permanently if I choose. No golden handcuffs, no leverage you can use to keep me trapped. Bruno studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're negotiating an exit strategy before you even start. I'm negotiating freedom, Mabel corrected. Real freedom. The kind where I'm choosing to stay, not forced to stay. Because if I'm going to help you survive, I need to know I can survive walking away. For a long moment, Bruno was silent, his fingers drumming once against the table, a rare tell of internal conflict. Then he pulled out a pen and made notes in the margin of the contract. 6-month severance, fully vested, regardless of how long you work. Paid in advance into an account only you control. You walk away tomorrow, the money's still yours. Mabel's breath caught. That's That's insane. I could just take the money and disappear. Yes, you could. Bruno's eyes held hers. But you won't, because I'm betting everything on the fact that you're someone who finishes the games she starts. Am I wrong? The challenge in his voice was magnetic, dangerous, irresistible. Mabel picked up the pen, her hand steady despite the way her heart raced. She signed her name with decisive strokes, then pushed the contract back across the table. Bruno signed beneath her signature, his writing bold and final. Then he stood and extended his hand, not across the table, but around it, stepping into her space with deliberate intention. Mabel stood to meet him, and when their hands clasped, the contact was electric. His palm was warm, his grip firm but not dominating, and the way his thumb pressed against the back of her hand felt less like a handshake and more like a promise. "Partners," Bruno said, his voice low and intense. "Equal partners in strategy." "Partners," Mabel agreed, acutely aware that neither of them were talking just about business. The space between them was charged with everything they'd been avoiding, the magnetic pull they'd been dancing around for 11 nights, the dangerous attraction that transcended intellectual respect. Bruno didn't release her hand immediately. Instead, his other hand came up, almost touching her face before he caught himself, dropping it back to his side. "This is going to be complicated," he said quietly. "Everything worth doing is," Mabel replied, finally pulling her hand away, though the absence felt like loss. "The board arrives tomorrow," Bruno said, his voice returning to something closer to his usual control. "Real scenarios, real stakes. Moretti's planning something major, and I need to understand it before it destroys everything I've built." "Then I guess I should start thinking like chaos," Mabel said, grabbing the folder of surveillance photos. As she turned to leave, Bruno's voice stopped her. "Mabel?" She looked back. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying, for trusting me with this." "Don't thank me yet," she replied, a slight smile playing at her lips. "You might discover hiring someone who thinks like your enemy is the most dangerous decision you've ever made." "I'm counting on it," Bruno said, and the way he looked at her made it clear he was talking about far more than strategy. The game had changed, the stakes were real, and neither of them were entirely sure anymore whether they were playing against Moretti, against each other, or against the increasingly impossible-to-ignore connection that threatened to consume them both. Bruno's penthouse office occupied the top floor of a Manhattan high-rise that probably had a legitimate business name Mabel never bothered to learn. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city's glittering chaos, but what captured her attention was the massive custom chessboard dominating the center of the room, each square large enough to hold detailed notes, photographs, location markers. "You're serious about this," Mabel said, setting down her worn backpack among furniture that cost more than her yearly rent. "I'm serious about survival," Bruno corrected, watching her circle the board with analytical focus. "The pieces represent key players. The squares are territories, operations, strategic assets. Moretti's attacks are marked in red." Mabel studied the configuration, her mind immediately processing patterns. Red markers clustered in seemingly random locations: a shipping warehouse, a restaurant in Queens, a legitimate construction company, a small art gallery. "These don't make sense territorially." "Exactly." Bruno moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that probably had an Italian name. No conventional logic. No clear objective, just chaos. "No." Mabel's fingers hovered over the pieces. "Not chaos. Misdirection." She moved 3 pieces rapidly, repositioning them. "He's not attacking your territory. He's attacking your attention. What are you not looking at while you're focused on these?" Bruno stared at the board, then at her. "My financial operations, the legitimate holdings that fund everything else." "Exactly. These attacks," she gestured to the red markers, "they're sacrificial pawns." He's making you defend pieces that don't actually matter while he positions for a real attack on your king. She met his eyes. He's playing chess while you're playing checkers. I hate how right you are, Bruno said, but there was admiration in his voice. Get used to it, Mabel replied, already moving pieces, building probability models. That's what you're paying me for. Over the next 3 days, the penthouse office became their world. Mabel arrived at dawn, worked through scenarios until midnight, surviving on coffee and the expensive takeout Bruno ordered without asking her preference, though somehow he always got it right. You're doing it again, Mabel said on the 4th morning, not looking up from the board where she was modeling Moretti's psychological profile through piece positioning. Doing what? Bruno looked up from financial reports. Staring at me instead of the analysis. She moved a black knight into an aggressive position. It's distracting. You're fascinating when you work, he said simply. You do this thing where you forget I exist and start muttering chess notation under your breath like you're casting spells. I'm building probability matrices, Mabel corrected, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks. And you do this thing where you assume watching me think is more productive than actually thinking yourself. Maybe it is. Bruno stood, moving around the table to see her configuration from her perspective. You're isolating Moretti's queen, his primary enforcer. Why? Because queens are powerful but vulnerable when overextended, Mabel explained, acutely aware of his proximity. Moretti's using his enforcer for all the visible attacks, which means he's either protecting his real strategy or the enforcer is the strategy, Bruno finished. He's making me focus on the lieutenant while he moves into position himself. Exactly. She turned to find him inches away, his dark eyes intense with the kind of intellectual excitement she'd only ever felt over a keyboard at 3 a.m. You're learning. I have an excellent teacher. His voice dropped lower. Even if she's merciless about pointing out my blind spots. Your blind spots are what's keeping you alive, Mabel said, not moving away. You assume everyone plays by the same rules you were taught. Moretti doesn't. He sacrifices pieces you'd never sacrifice. He values chaos over control. And what do you value? Bruno asked quietly. The question shifted something between them, from professional to dangerously personal. Survival, Mabel said finally. Same as you, just different methods. No. Bruno's hand moved to the board, his fingers brushing against hers on a white bishop. You value freedom. Every strategy you build has an escape route. Every scenario includes an exit. You're not just modeling Moretti, you're modeling how to disappear if this all falls apart. Mabel's breath caught. That's just tactical thinking. That's trauma, Bruno said gently. I know because I do the same thing. Every conversation has 3 exit strategies. Every relationship has calculated distance. We're both so afraid of being trapped that we've built our entire lives around mobility. This is getting too personal, Mabel said, but she didn't move. We're using chess language to talk about everything except what we're actually feeling, Bruno continued, his voice rough with honesty. Attack, defense, sacrifice. These are just metaphors for fear and trust, and the fact that neither of us knows how to be vulnerable without treating it like a tactical disadvantage. Bruno, when did you start playing? He asked. The war games. When did surviving require you to become a tactical genius? The question landed like a physical blow. Mabel turned back to the board, her hands gripping the edge. For a long moment, she was silent, calculating whether honesty was worth the exposure. I was 17, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. My father he had a gambling problem. Owed money to people who don't negotiate payment plans. They came to our house one night to collect. Bruno went very still behind her. I was home alone, Mabel continued. 3 men. They had questions about where my father was, what assets we had, whether I knew how to make him pay. I didn't have answers they wanted. She took a shaky breath. I locked myself in my room with my laptop and called 911, but they were breaking down the door, and I was terrified and helpless and completely out of control. Mabel, the police came in time, she said quickly. I was fine, physically, but after that I couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still. Every sound was a threat. Every stranger was dangerous. My therapist said it was hypervigilance, PTSD. I said it was reality. Bruno's hand settled carefully on her shoulder. Not possessive, not controlling, just present. The war games helped, Mabel said, her voice steadying. Online strategy games where I controlled armies, anticipated attacks, built defenses. I could stay up all night fighting battles I could actually win. Problems that had solutions, threats I could neutralize with the right tactical thinking. She turned to face him. I played for 6 years, thousands of hours, became ranked in the top percentile globally. Because in those games I was never helpless, I was always 3 moves ahead. And in real life? Bruno asked gently. In real life I've been running ever since, Mabel admitted. New cities, new jobs, new identities when necessary, always moving because staying still means being found, being trapped, being that terrified 17-year-old again. Bruno's other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I'm not going to trap you, he said quietly. The exit clause in your contract, I meant it. You can walk away any time. I know. Mabel's hand covered his, pressing it against her cheek. That's why I haven't. They stood there, the chessboard between them covered in scenarios of violence and strategy, but in this moment, just 2 people who'd survived by never letting anyone close enough to hurt them, accidentally discovering what it felt like to be seen. We're terrible at this, Bruno said, a slight smile touching his lips. At being honest, at trusting. Terrible, Mabel agreed. But she was smiling too. We should probably stick to chess. Probably. But neither of them moved away. The city glittered beyond the windows, and somewhere out there, Moretti was planning his next move. But in this moment, in the suspended intimacy of shared vulnerability, the most dangerous game wasn't the one on the board. It was the one they were playing with each other, where every honest word was a sacrifice, every moment of trust was a gamble, and neither of them were entirely sure anymore whether they were opponents or partners in something far more terrifying than survival. They were learning to hope. Mabel woke on the leather sofa in Bruno's office at 4 a.m., disoriented and covered with his suit jacket. The chessboard glowed under a single desk lamp, pieces scattered in the configuration she'd been analyzing before exhaustion claimed her. Bruno sat at his desk, working through financial reports with the grim focus of someone who hadn't slept either. You should have woken me, she said, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. You needed rest. He didn't look up from the spreadsheets. You've been working 16-hour days. So have you. Mabel moved to the board, studying her previous night's work with fresh eyes. Something nagged at her, a pattern she'd been too tired to fully process. She stared at Moretti's attack sequence, tracking the timestamps, the targets, the methods. Then she started moving pieces backward, reconstructing each assault in reverse, looking for the origin point of information. What is it? Bruno asked, finally noticing her intensity. The chaos is too perfect, Mabel said slowly, her analytical mind accelerating. Look at this. She pointed to a red marker on the board. Moretti hit your warehouse in Red Hook on the 15th, but that shipment was moved there only 12 hours earlier, last-minute change due to dock worker strikes. How did he know? Bruno stood, moving closer. We have information leaks. It happens. Now look at this one. She indicated another attack. Your construction company in Queens. Moretti's people showed up exactly 4 hours after you transferred $8 million in cash there for a real estate acquisition. That's not a leak. That's real-time intelligence. You're saying he has someone inside, Bruno said carefully, I'm saying he has someone high enough inside to access operational changes, financial movements, strategic decisions. Mabel's hands moved rapidly across the board, isolating patterns. Every attack isn't random chaos, it's perfectly informed chaos. The randomness is camouflage for how precisely he knows where to hit. Bruno's jaw tightened. How many people have that level of access? You tell me. Mabel turned to face him. Who's in the room when you make last-minute operational changes? Who knows your financial movements? Who has access to your schedule, your security rotations, your strategic planning? My inner circle, Bruno said quietly. 5 people, men I've known for years, men my father trusted. One of them is feeding Moretti everything. Mabel watched his face carefully. And they're good at it, because they're making it look like external intelligence gathering rather than internal betrayal. Bruno moved to his desk, pulling out a file with photographs and dossiers. His hands were steady, but Mabel could see the tension in his shoulders, the warrior preparing for a wound he didn't want to acknowledge. Dante Romano, Bruno said, laying out the first photo. My cousin, grew up together. He's loyal to family above everything. Mabel studied Dante's history, the pattern of his movements. He wasn't present for 3 of the attacks where information leaked. Cross him off. Bruno continued through the circle. 2 other soldiers who'd served his father, each with alibis or operational constraints that eliminated them as suspects. Then he hesitated before laying out the final photograph. Carlo Messina, he said, and something in his voice made Mabel's chest tighten. My father's oldest friend. He was there when I was born, taught me how to negotiate my first territorial agreement. He's been my consigliere since I took over the family. Mabel picked up the photograph, studying the distinguished man with silver hair and warm eyes. Then she turned to the board, tracking the information leaks against operational meetings. Financial transfers, strategic decisions. Her stomach dropped. It's him, she said quietly. No. Bruno's voice was flat with denial. Carlo would never. Look at the pattern. Mabel started moving pieces, showing him the correlation. Every single leak happens within 6 hours of a meeting Carlo attended. Every financial transfer Moretti knew about, Carlo had access to. The warehouse change. Carlo was copied on that logistics email. The Queen's construction site. Carlo countersigned the transfer authorization. That's circumstantial, Bruno argued, but his voice lacked conviction. This isn't. Mabel pulled out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. I've been tracking communication patterns through your phone system. Don't look at me like that. You gave me complete analytical autonomy. She turned the screen toward him. Carlo makes a 15-minute call to an unlisted number every Thursday at 9 p.m. Exactly 12 hours later, Moretti makes a move. Bruno stared at the data, his face draining of color. He's been with my family for 40 years. Which makes him the perfect betrayal, Mabel said gently. Someone you'd never suspect. Someone whose loyalty is assumed, not questioned. Someone who has access to everything because he's trusted with everything. Bruno sat down heavily, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely lost. Why? Why would Carlo do this? Mabel pulled up financial records she'd been cross-referencing. Your father's death 3 years ago. There was a succession dispute. Several capos thought Carlo should have been named successor instead of you. He was older, more experienced. But your father chose you. Carlo supported that decision, Bruno said, but doubt crept into his voice. Publicly. Mabel showed him encrypted communications she'd traced through back channels. Privately, he's been bleeding your operations dry. Small amounts, unnoticeable individually, but collectively millions. He's not just betraying you to Moretti, he's positioning for Moretti to eliminate you so he can negotiate power sharing in the aftermath. The evidence was damning, incontrovertible, and it was destroying him. Mabel watched Bruno process the betrayal, not with anger, but with devastating grief. The man who'd taught him strategy had been using that same knowledge to dismantle everything Bruno had built. "I should have seen it," Bruno said finally, his voice hollow. "I trusted him. I never questioned—" "That's not a weakness," Mabel interrupted, moving to stand in front of him. "Trust isn't stupidity. He exploited your loyalty, your love for him. That's on him, not you." "My father would have seen it." "Your father trained you to see enemies," Mabel said firmly. "Not to see betrayal from family. Those are different skills." She knelt so she was eye level with him. "Bruno, look at me." He met her eyes, and the raw vulnerability there nearly broke her heart. "This doesn't make you weak," Mabel said quietly. "It makes you human, and being human in your world, that's the bravest thing you can be." Something cracked in his carefully maintained control. Bruno reached for her, pulling her close with desperate intensity, and Mabel went willingly, wrapping her arms around him as his forehead pressed against her shoulder. "I trusted him with everything," Bruno said, his voice muffled. "My life, my family's legacy, you." "I know." Mabel's hand moved to his hair, holding him steady. "And now you know who you can actually trust." He pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face with trembling intensity. "You. I trust you." "I know," she whispered. "I trust you too, which is terrifying." "Mabel." Whatever he was going to say dissolved as he kissed her instead, and it wasn't the calculated passion she might have expected. It was raw, desperate, honest, a drowning man finding air, a warrior lowering his armor, two people who'd survived by never being vulnerable, discovering what it felt like to be completely exposed with someone who wouldn't weaponize it. Mabel kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands gripping his shoulders, anchoring them both. The board with its pieces and betrayals and strategic nightmares faded. The city beyond the windows disappeared. There was only this, the unexpected safety of being fully known and choosing to stay anyway. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bruno rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates everything." "Everything was already complicated," Mabel replied. "This just makes it honest." "Carlo will make his move soon," Bruno said, reality crashing back. "Now that we know, we have to act before he realizes we know." "Then we set a trap," Mabel said, her strategic mind already working. "We use the board to plan his exposure. We give him false information and watch where it goes." "We," Bruno repeated, and the word sounded like a promise. "Partners," Mabel confirmed. "In strategy and everything else." The game had changed again. The enemy was inside. And the two people least equipped to trust anyone had accidentally discovered they could trust each other, which made them either the most dangerous partnership in Manhattan or the most vulnerable. Possibly both. The secure safe house in Tribeca smelled like coffee and dread. Mabel sat across from Bruno at a converted dining table now serving as a tactical command center, surveillance feeds glowing on 3 monitors. Carlo's movements had accelerated dramatically in the past 24 hours. Frantic calls to unknown numbers, meetings with Moretti's representatives caught on their planted surveillance devices, and most damning, a scheduled treaty meeting at an upscale restaurant in Midtown for the following evening. "He knows we know," Mabel said, rewinding the surveillance footage. "Look at his posture, his communication pattern. He's moving like someone who's running out of time." Bruno stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the Manhattan skyline. He'd barely slept, barely eaten, processing the betrayal in the way men of his world learn to process catastrophes, by converting pain into strategy. "The meeting tomorrow," Bruno said quietly. "It's the play, the final move." "The treaty is supposed to be a ceasefire negotiation with Moretti," Mabel confirmed, pulling up the meeting details. "Carlo organized it. He's supposed to mediate." "He's supposed to eliminate me," Bruno corrected. The meeting is a setup. Moretti makes a move against my person while Carlo signals the police, who are probably already positioned. Frame it as an external threat. Arrest me for conspiracy or violence, and suddenly Moretti owns the territory while Carlo negotiates his survival with whoever takes over. It's elegant, actually, Mabel said, her analytical mind appreciating the strategy even as her heart rejected it. He uses both sides to destroy you, then positions himself as the neutral ground where power consolidates. Very elegant. Bruno's voice was hollow. Very Italian. My father would have done exactly the same thing in Carlo's position. Mabel stood and moved to him, taking his hand. We counter it. We use the board to— No. Bruno pulled away, his jaw tightening. You're leaving. Excuse me? I'm sending you away, Bruno said, his tone brooking no negotiation. Out of the city. Somewhere safe. You've done what I hired you to do. You identified the threat. You solved the problem. Now you take your severance, your freedom, and you disappear. Mabel stared at him, anger rising like heat. Are you actually suggesting I abandon you right now? I'm suggesting you survive. His eyes were fierce with protectiveness and desperation. Mabel, if this goes wrong tomorrow, if anything goes wrong, I will not have you caught in the fallout. You get your agency, your resources, your exit strategy. You use it. No. Mabel's voice was sharp as a blade. You don't get to make unilateral decisions about my safety, Bruno. That's not a partnership. That's not even a negotiation. That's the same control dynamic you've built your entire life around. This is different. It's exactly the same, Mabel interrupted. You're afraid, so you're trying to control the outcome by controlling me. But I'm not going to let you. I'm not leaving. I'm staying, and we're going to counter Carlo's move together because that's what partners do. Partners don't watch each other die, Bruno said harshly, and cowards don't watch the people they love risk everything for them and just run away, Mabel countered. She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. I love you, you incredibly stubborn Italian man, which means I'm not going anywhere. I'm seeing this through. We're seeing this through. Bruno's hands came up, cupping her face like he was afraid she might disappear. You could die. So could you. That's been true since I walked into this. Mabel's hands gripped his wrists. But I'm not afraid of dying, Bruno. I'm afraid of living and discovering I abandoned the one person who actually sees me. That's the only death that matters. Something broke in his expression. The careful control, the protective distance, the fear. He kissed her with desperate intensity, and she kissed him back, pouring every ounce of commitment and defiance into it. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. You're going to get me killed, he whispered. Probably, Mabel agreed, but I'm going to do it while we're winning. Bruno pulled back slightly, studying her face. A slow smile spread across his features, the first genuine smile she'd seen since they'd identified Carlo's betrayal. You're absolutely insane. I learned from the best. Mabel squeezed his hands. Now let's talk about Carlo's blind spot. They moved back to the tactical display, and Mabel's analytical mind shifted into overdrive. She traced Carlo's communication pattern, his meeting logistics, the security arrangements for the restaurant. He thinks you'll react like a standard chess piece, Mabel said, moving pieces on her mental board. A king under threat moves defensively. He retreats, he fortifies, he plays it safe. Carlo's counting on that. He's counting on you taking protective measures that leave you vulnerable to his real attack. So I don't, Bruno said, understanding dawning in his eyes. I move like you move, unexpected, aggressive, unconventional. Exactly. Mabel pulled up the restaurant layout. The meeting is tomorrow at 8 p.m., supposedly neutral ground. But Carlo will have men positioned to neutralize you before the police arrive. The police signal is just insurance. The real threat is internal. And if I don't show up as expected, then we control the narrative, Mabel said. "We give the police a reason to be there that has nothing to do with Carlo's plan. We expose him before he can execute the setup." Bruno's phone buzzed. A message from Dante. Carlo just authorized massive cash transfers, moving assets, preparing to run. "He's accelerating," Bruno said grimly. "He knows we're closing in." "Which means tomorrow needs to happen his way, but on our terms," Mabel said. She stood up, pacing, her mind working through scenarios at lightning speed. "You go to the meeting. Everything appears normal, but your exit isn't defensive. It's a calculated strike." "Against Carlo?" "Against everyone's expectations," Mabel corrected. "We let the police move as planned, but we position you as the one who called them. You become the victim who neutralized the threat, not the criminal they came to arrest." "That requires timing more precise than anything we've ever attempted," Bruno said quietly. "I know." Mabel turned to face him. "Which is why I'm going to be in your ear the entire time. We'll use the secure comms. I'll monitor the police frequency, Carlo's signals, Moretti's movements. You execute exactly as we plan, and you walk out of that restaurant free. And if something goes wrong?" "It won't," Mabel said with absolute confidence. "Because you're going to play like you're not just defending a kingdom, Bruno. You're going to play like you're protecting the one person who actually matters to you, and that changes everything." Bruno pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. "I love you, Mabel Smith." "I know," she whispered. "And I'm going to make sure you survive to spend the rest of your life regretting that admission." He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to ease some of the terrible tension in his shoulders. "Partners?" "Always," Mabel confirmed. "Now let's destroy a traitor." The restaurant occupied the 34th floor of a Manhattan tower, all floor-to-ceiling windows and understated Italian elegance. Bruno arrived at precisely 8 p.m., immaculate in a charcoal suit, moving with the controlled confidence that had defined his entire adult life. To anyone watching, he appeared exactly as expected, a mafia boss arriving for a treaty negotiation he believed would secure his position. Only Mabel knew the truth. Everything about tomorrow would be determined by what happened in the next 60 minutes. "I'm in position," Bruno said quietly, his lips barely moving as he took his seat at the reserved table. The microphone embedded in his cufflink transmitted the message to Mabel, who sat in a van 3 blocks away, monitoring every frequency available to law enforcement, Moretti's organization, and Carlo's people. "Visual on Carlo," Mabel confirmed, watching the security feed they'd hacked into before the meeting. "He's 2 minutes out, 2 men with him, both armed." Moretti arrived first, flanked by his own detail. The negotiation began with the choreographed civility of criminal enterprise, offers and counteroffers, territorial concessions framed as mutual advantage, agreements designed to hold until someone figured out how to break them. "You're doing great," Mabel's voice came through Bruno's earpiece, steady and calm. "Stay patient. Don't deviate." Carlo entered like a man arriving at his own coronation, moving directly to Bruno's side with the familiarity of decades. "Bruno, my boy, you look tired. This business with Moretti has been wearing on you." "It has," Bruno agreed easily, ordering wine he wouldn't drink. "Which is why I'm grateful for your mediation, Carlo. Your guidance has been invaluable these past weeks." The words were coded, a message only Carlo would understand, a reference to all the ways he'd guided Moretti's attacks, all the confidential information he'd funneled to the external enemy. Bruno watched Carlo's pupils dilate slightly, watched his hand move toward the phone concealed beneath his jacket. "Incoming signal," Mabel announced. "Police are 2 blocks away. Carlo just sent the activation code to his men." Bruno stood smoothly, moving toward the restroom, a predetermined move in their counter-strategy. As he passed Moretti's position, his hand brushed against the man's wine glass, and in that split second of contact, he left something behind, A cell phone containing recordings of every conversation between Carlo and Moretti, downloaded directly from the secure systems Bruno had hacked 3 hours earlier. "That's our insurance policy." Mabel's voice was tense with excitement. "But you need to execute the escape now." As Bruno emerged from the restroom, 2 of Carlo's men moved toward him, their hands reaching inside their jackets. At the exact same moment, police officers in tactical gear flooded the restaurant's entrance, not positioned to arrest Bruno, but positioned between him and Carlo's people. "Police! Nobody move!" The officers fanned out, securing the space with practiced efficiency. "Bruno Costa?" One of the officers called out, gun drawn but not raised. "Yes, I'm Bruno Costa," Bruno said calmly, his hands visible. "And I'm grateful you're here. I called your department 45 minutes ago to report an active threat from Carlo Messina, who has been coordinating with external criminal organizations to eliminate me. The weapon these men are carrying should provide your first piece of evidence." The performance was flawless. Bruno positioned himself as the victim who'd orchestrated his own rescue, the strategic genius who'd anticipated the trap. Carlo's men were disarmed and detained before they could react. Moretti tried to leave quietly, but the officers had already blocked that exit, and Carlo himself stood frozen in shock, realizing that the man he'd mentored, the man he'd taught to think strategically, had outplayed him completely. "You recorded us," Carlo said, his voice hollow with realization. "Everything," Bruno confirmed quietly. "Mabel mapped your psychology perfectly. You were so focused on executing the plan exactly as you'd imagined it that you never considered I'd modified the rules." The phone containing the recordings was discovered in Moretti's possession, exactly where Bruno had planted it during that brief, crucial contact. The combination of the recordings, the armed men, and Carlo's own behavior created an undeniable narrative. Carlo had coordinated with Moretti to orchestrate Bruno's elimination and frame him for organized crime activity. Instead, Carlos had been caught red-handed. As officers secured Carlo in handcuffs, he finally understood the scope of his defeat. "Who helped you plan this?" he demanded. "It's too sophisticated for you alone. Your father would never have—" "My father never had someone who loved him enough to see more possibilities than just survival," Bruno interrupted coldly. "That's why he lost, and that's why you're finished." 20 minutes later, Bruno emerged from the restaurant into the Manhattan night. Police were processing Moretti's men, securing evidence, notifying federal agencies of organized crime activity they'd uncover through the recorded conversations. The narrative was set. Bruno had uncovered a conspiracy against his life and had turned evidence over to the authorities. It was a narrative that would protect him far more effectively than violence ever could. Mabel was waiting in a secure location 3 blocks away. The moment Bruno stepped through the door of the safe house, she launched herself at him, kissing him with all the fear and relief and triumph of the past 24 hours. "You did it," she breathed against his lips. "You actually did it." Bruno pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands still shaking from adrenaline and raw emotion. "We did it," he corrected, framing her face with desperate tenderness. "But I'm never letting you do something that terrifying again. You don't get to make unilateral decisions about my safety," Mabel reminded him with a slight smile. "Remember?" "Yeah." He kissed her again, deeper this time, pouring everything into it. Gratitude, love, the overwhelming relief of survival. "I remember." They moved to the couch, Bruno pulling her into his lap, his arms wrapped around her like she might disappear. Outside, the city glittered with the indifference of New York, but in this moment, they were the only 2 people in the world who mattered. "Moretti will want revenge," Mabel said against his chest. "The recordings we planted on him expose his entire operation. Federal agencies are going to descend on him like locusts." "That's what we wanted," Bruno said quietly. "Moretti eliminated. Carlo imprisoned. My family's operations exposed enough to force legitimacy, but not enough to destroy me. The public narrative is that I cooperated with law enforcement to break up an internal conspiracy. It gives me credibility with authorities and immunity from most charges." "You've thought through the endgame," Mabel observed, looking up at him. "Everything after the victory." "I learned from the best," Bruno replied. "You taught me that the most important move is always the one after the checkmate. It's where strategy becomes vision." Mabel's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Bruno reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I'm saying I'm done with half measures. I'm done with temporary arrangements. I'm done with anything less than absolute permanent commitment to you." He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring, elegant and understated, nothing flashy or ostentatious, just absolute beauty in perfect simplicity. "Marry me, Mabel," Bruno said quietly. "Build this new empire with me, not the criminal one, the legitimate one. A life where we use strategy for creation instead of control, where our brilliance builds things instead of destroying them." Mabel was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Absolutely yes." The next morning they sat on the terrace of Bruno's penthouse as dawn broke over Manhattan. The city looked different somehow, less threatening, more full of possibility. Bruno held Mabel's hand, the diamond catching the early light, and for the first time in his entire adult life, he felt something that wasn't strategic calculation or controlled intensity. He felt peace. "My father used to tell me that sentiment was weakness," Bruno said quietly, running his thumb across Mabel's knuckles. "That love was a liability you couldn't afford in this business. He said the men who won were the ones who could sacrifice anything, territory, money, people, without hesitation or regret." "He was wrong," Mabel said simply. "He was," Bruno agreed, "and I spent my entire adult life emulating him. I built an empire on his principles: control through distance, power through isolation, victory through the ability to eliminate anyone who became a liability." He turned to face her. "And it was killing me, Mabel. I didn't realize how hollow I'd become until you beat me at chess and made me see things differently." "I didn't make you do anything," Mabel said softly. "I just showed you another option existed." "No," Bruno corrected, his hand moving to her face. "You showed me that being seen, actually genuinely seen by another person, wasn't a weakness. It was the strongest thing I could possibly do. When you identified Carlo's betrayal, when you planned my escape, when you stood there and told me you wouldn't leave, that was you choosing me. That's what love actually is, not the elimination of liability. It's the voluntary choice to make yourself vulnerable with someone you trust absolutely." Mabel leaned into his touch, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm going to change everything," Bruno continued. "Not because I'm a good person suddenly, but because you've made me understand that there's another way to build power, strategic power, lasting power, the kind that comes from building people up instead of tearing them down." "What does that look like?" Mabel asked. "It looks like us," Bruno said simply. "Partners, equal stakes. Your voice is as valid as mine in every decision. I consult with you, and you get to say no without consequences. We use the legitimate assets to build something better than what we're tearing down." "The youth centers," Mabel said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The youth centers," Bruno confirmed. "And mentorship programs, strategic thinking education, opportunities for kids who don't have families that can teach them to survive in this city. We take everything my father taught me about chess and strategy, and we give it to people who need it, without the violence or the moral compromise." "Your family won't support that," Mabel said carefully. "My family doesn't get a vote anymore," Bruno replied. "Dante will honor my succession because he respects my decisions. The rest of the organization will fall in line because they understand that legitimacy is survival now. The federal government is going to be watching us closely after the arrests this week. Either we adapt or we disappear." "And you're choosing to adapt," Mabel said. I'm choosing you, Bruno corrected. And adaptation is just the logical consequence of that choice. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. I love you, Mabel Smith. I love the way you challenge me. I love the way you see possibilities where I see obstacles. I love that you were terrified and you stayed anyway because you believed in us. I love you too, Mabel whispered against his lips. Even when you're being insufferable about making unilateral decisions. Bruno laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. I'm going to work on that. You better, Mabel said, pulling back, because I'm going to call you out on it every single time. I know, Bruno said, and his smile was radiant with the kind of joy that only comes from being completely, vulnerably known and loved anyway. That's why I want to spend the rest of my life with you. They stood together on the terrace as the sun painted Manhattan in shades of gold and rose, two people who'd survived in isolation for far too long, finally discovering what it meant to be safe inside another person's presence. The chessboard in the office below was still covered with pieces, the tactical scenarios that had saved Bruno's life, the strategic brilliance that had dismantled an empire. But standing here with Mabel, Bruno realized that the real victory wasn't on the board at all. It was in this moment, in the decision to be something more than what his father had taught him to be. It was in the choice to let someone love him without treating it as weakness. What are you thinking? Mabel asked, squeezing his hand. That I spent 34 years learning how to win wars, Bruno said quietly. And it took a frantic waitress with coffee-stained hands to teach me that the only war that matters is the one inside yourself. And I just won it. Mabel rested her head on his shoulder, and they stood together as the city woke around them, full of possibility, full of danger, full of the beautiful, uncertain future they were going to build together. 6 months later, the Centro Strategia occupied the entire ground floor of a renovated building in East Harlem. The name meant Strategy Center in Italian, and the space was designed to be exactly what Mabel had envisioned, a sanctuary for young people who needed to learn how to think their way out of situations that offered no easy exits. The main hall held 12 different game stations, chess, of course, but also Go, strategic war games, historical battle simulations. Along the walls, photographs documented the lives of students who'd passed through the program, kids from the neighborhood who'd learned to think strategically about their futures and were now in college, apprenticeships, legitimate careers. Mabel moved through the space with the quiet confidence of someone who'd finally stopped running. She wore designer clothes now, none of the uniform she'd hidden behind at the night watch, but her energy was the same, frantic, brilliant, utterly fearless. She was teaching a group of 12-year-olds about tempo in chess when Bruno appeared, carrying a folder that made her immediately suspicious. Mr. Costa, she said, using her teacher voice, don't you have legitimate business to attend to? I do, Bruno said, exchanging knowing looks with the students who were amused by their teacher's complete lack of deference to the most powerful man in Manhattan. But it involves my wife, so I figured it took precedence. Wife, one of the students said, grinning. That's still wild. The boss is married to the chess lady. The chess lady, Mabel corrected, though she was smiling as Bruno wrapped an arm around her waist, is also a partner in the business, a partner in the strategy, and a partner who occasionally makes very foolish decisions like marrying Italian men who think they're charming. I'm not charming, Bruno said, kissing the top of her head, but I'm devoted, which is better. Miss Mabel, should we just tell him the answer? Another student asked, clearly in on something. Mabel's head snapped toward Bruno. What did you do? Bruno opened the folder, revealing architectural renderings and financial projections. I did what you taught me to do. I played the long game. He spread out the documents on a chess table. The Centro Strategia has exceeded all our projections. 85% of graduates are pursuing higher education or skilled careers. The federal government is so impressed, they want to fund expansion. Bruno, This is the proposal for a second center, he continued, pointing to the renderings. East Harlem, which we just opened. But the feds want 5 more, 1 in every borough, and they're offering to match our funding dollar for the next 10 years. Mabel stared at the documents, her analytical mind immediately calculating the implications. That's $50 million in matched funding. Conservatively, Bruno confirmed, which means we're looking at genuine, institutional transformation of youth development in New York City. By the time these kids finish their educational trajectories, there will be pipeline infrastructure to keep them moving forward. Mabel couldn't find the words. This is what happens when you teach someone who's been trained to think in terms of territorial control to think in terms of systemic change instead, Bruno said quietly. I spent 30 years learning to run an empire. You taught me to build a legacy. He pulled out a small envelope from inside his jacket. Inside was a photograph, the 2 of them at their wedding, which had been small and private. Held in a chapel in Tribeca with only Dante and 3 of his most trusted people as witnesses. In the photo, they were laughing at something no one else would ever know about, their hands intertwined, their joy absolutely genuine. Mabel Smith Costa, Bruno said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. I want you to know that this is what I was thinking about when I signed the initial contract with the federal government. Not the money, not the expansion. This moment, you in this space you created, teaching young people to survive with their minds instead of their violence. This is victory. This is legacy. You're going to make me cry in front of students, Mabel said, but she was already smiling through tears. Good, Bruno said. They need to see that being powerful doesn't mean being untouchable. It means being willing to be touched by the things you love. He stepped back, pulling out a small velvet envelope he'd been concealing in his jacket pocket. Inside was a set of matching chess piece cufflinks, white queen and black king, interlocked. 1 for each of us, he explained, slipping one on. So when we're apart, we remember that we're still playing the same game, with the same goal. Checkmate against the world that tried to contain us. That's incredibly sentimental for a man who claims not to be charming, Mabel said, putting on the other cufflink. I've learned a lot in 6 months, Bruno replied. He looked around the space at the students who were trying very hard to pretend they weren't completely invested in this conversation, and most of it from her. The students broke into knowing smiles, and Mabel laughed, shaking her head. Okay, everyone, back to the exercise. Your goal is to see 12 moves ahead like your teacher. And more importantly, she added, glancing at Bruno, play like someone who's not afraid to sacrifice the expected outcome for something better. As the students returned to their games, Bruno pulled Mabel into the office area, a smaller version of his penthouse office, but with windows overlooking the neighborhood instead of the skyline. There's something else, Bruno said, and the note in his voice made her look up sharply. Something I need to tell you. You're scaring me, Mabel said. Is everything okay? Everything is better than okay, Bruno confirmed. I'm stepping back from the organization. Completely. Mabel's eyes widened. What? I've been training Dante to take over for the past 6 months, Bruno explained calmly. The legitimate businesses, the import operations, all of it transitions to him next month. I'm going to remain in advisory capacity only, but operationally, I'm finished. The Mafia boss dies tomorrow, Mabel. He transforms into someone else entirely. Into what? Mabel asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Into a strategist, Bruno said simply. Into the founder and director of a non-profit dedicated to youth development and mentorship. Into a husband who goes home every evening to the woman who saved his life. Into someone who builds instead of destroys. Mabel was crying now, genuine tears of joy and relief. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said. I'm barely getting started, Bruno said. and he pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promises and redemption and the absolutely terrifying, absolutely beautiful possibility of a future built on something other than power and control. The final moment came as they stood together in the Centro Strategia as the evening settled over East Harlem. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Students were packing up their chess sets, preparing to leave for homes and families, carrying with them the knowledge that they could survive through strategy, through brilliance, through the absolute refusal to accept predetermined limitations. Bruno and Mabel stood at the center of the main hall, surrounded by the physical manifestation of their partnership, a space where young people learned that the most powerful weapon wasn't violence or threats or inherited power. It was the ability to think your way through impossible situations. "We did this," Mabel said quietly, her hand in Bruno's. "We actually did this." "You did this," Bruno corrected. "I just provided resources and occasionally attempted to micromanage." "You still do," Mabel observed with a smile. "I know. You called me out on it this morning about the teacher hiring process. And you listened eventually." "Because you're always right," Bruno said simply. "About strategy, about people, about what matters. You see things I'm blind to." Mabel squeezed his hand. "And you have courage I don't. You were willing to burn everything down and build it differently." "That takes a different kind of brilliance." They stood together as the last students left, as the evening deepened into night. The chess pieces on the tables gleamed in the low light, black and white, knights and queens, bishops and kings. All the pieces that had defined their journey from strangers to partners to something far more profound. Two people who'd learned that the greatest victory isn't conquering the board, it's transforming the game entirely. "What are you thinking?" Bruno asked, squeezing her hand. "That 8 moves ago, you invited a waitress to play chess as a joke," Mabel said. "And somehow that became this. That became us." "That became everything," Bruno corrected. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You were never a joke, Mabel. You were always the endgame. Every move I've made since that night has been moving toward you." "That's very chess-forward of you," Mabel teased. "I learned from the best," Bruno replied. They walked toward the exit together, hand in hand, ready to return to the penthouse overlooking Manhattan, to the life they were building, to the absolute, terrifying, beautiful future of two people who'd learned to trust each other completely. At the door, Mabel paused, turning back to look at the Centro Strategia one more time. Tomorrow morning, 12 new students would arrive for orientation. They would learn strategy, mentorship, and most importantly, they would learn that brilliance could be a tool for creation as much as it was a tool for survival. "Thank you," she said quietly to Bruno, "for seeing me, for trusting me, for letting me stay." "Thank you for staying," Bruno replied, "for being fierce enough to refuse my attempt at protection, for being brilliant enough to build this, for loving me when I barely knew how to be loved." They stepped out into the Manhattan night, arm in arm, equal partners in a strategy that had transformed their lives entirely. The chess pieces remained on the tables, waiting for tomorrow's moves, tomorrow's brilliant young minds, tomorrow's small, fierce victories against impossible odds. But in this moment, the most important game had already been won. Two people who'd learned survival in isolation